I should have known something was wrong the moment I walked into Murphy's pawn shop on Southeast Morrison Street in Portland, Oregon. The bell above the door didn't ring when I entered. It made this low, mournful sound like a funeral dirge. The elderly man behind the counter looked up at me with eyes that seemed to hold too much knowledge, too much sadness. He watched me browse the jewelry case with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between pity and resignation. I had been looking for a replacement ring for weeks. My ex-fiancée had taken back the engagement ring when she left, claiming it was a family heirloom that needed to stay in her bloodline. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was keeping the ring but discarding me. I needed something to fill the pale band of skin on my finger, something to make me feel whole again. The pawn shops in Portland's inner districts were full of desperate people's former treasures, and I figured I could find something meaningful at a price I could afford. The ring caught my eye immediately. It sat alone in a small velvet-lined box, separated from the other jewelry like it was quarantined. Simple white gold band, delicate but substantial, with 7 tiny diamonds embedded around the circumference. It looked expensive, far more valuable than anything else in the case, yet the price tag read $20. When I asked to see it, the old man hesitated for a long moment before retrieving his keys. "Are you sure about this one, son?" he asked, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the case. Sometimes the prettiest things carry the heaviest burdens. I laughed it off as typical pawn shop mystique, the kind of theatrical warning that makes customers feel like they're getting something special. The ring fit perfectly on my ring finger, sliding on as if it had been made specifically for my hand. The moment it settled into place, I felt a strange tingling sensation, like a mild electric current running through the metal. I attributed it to nerves and the excitement of finally finding something beautiful and affordable. The old man rang up the sale without another word, but I caught him making the sign of the cross as I left the shop. I should have paid attention to that warning. I should have listened to the voice in the back of my mind that whispered this was too easy, too perfect. Instead, I walked out onto Morrison Street feeling like I had won some kind of lottery. The first vision came that night. I had been living in a studio apartment above a coffee shop on Hawthorne Boulevard, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbors' entire lives playing out. I fell asleep watching Netflix on my laptop, and somewhere in the transition between consciousness and dreams, I stopped being myself. I was standing in a different apartment, one with hardwood floors and large windows that looked out onto what I recognized as the Pearl District. The furnishings were expensive but cold, all sharp angles and neutral colors that suggested wealth without warmth. I looked down at my hands and screamed. They weren't my hands. They were smaller, more delicate, with perfectly manicured nails painted a deep red. I was wearing a silk nightgown that I had never owned, and when I caught my reflection in the dark window, a stranger's face stared back at me. The woman in the reflection was Asian, probably in her late 20s, with long black hair and features that would have been beautiful if not for the haunted expression in her dark eyes. She looked terrified, constantly glancing toward a bedroom door as if expecting something terrible to emerge. I tried to move to control this body that wasn't mine, but I was trapped as a passenger in someone else's nightmare. That's when I heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps crossing the hardwood floor of what must have been the bedroom. The woman's heart rate spiked, and I felt her fear flood through me like ice water in my veins. She pressed herself against the living room wall, trying to become invisible, but there was nowhere to hide in the open floor plan of the expensive apartment. "Margaret!" a man's voice called out, and the sound made the woman's entire body tense with terror. "Margaret, where did you put my watch?" The voice was wrong somehow, too controlled, too calm. It carried an undertone of violence that made every instinct scream danger. Margaret, I somehow knew that was her name, that I was experiencing her memories, pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle her breathing. I could feel her thoughts racing, trying to remember where she had last seen the watch, knowing that any wrong answer would result in pain. I think it's on the dresser," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, it's not." The footsteps were getting closer. "I looked there. Where did you put it?" "I don't know, David. I haven't touched your watch." The silence that followed was worse than shouting would have been. I felt Margaret's muscles coiling with the anticipation of violence, her body preparing for impact. When David finally appeared in the doorway, I understood why she was so afraid. He was tall, probably 6'3", with the build of someone who spent serious time in the gym. His blonde hair was perfectly styled, even though it was nearly midnight, and he wore an expression of cold rage that never quite reached his blue eyes. "Don't lie to me, Margaret," he said, crossing the room with predatory grace. "You know I hate it when you lie to me." I'm not lying, I swear. Maybe you left it at the office or in your car. The backhand came so fast that neither Margaret nor I saw it coming. The impact sent her stumbling backward into the kitchen island, and I tasted blood where her teeth cut into her lip. The pain was absolutely real, as sharp and immediate as if it were happening to my own body. Through Margaret's eyes, I watched David's expression never change, remaining coldly furious but perfectly controlled. I didn't leave it anywhere, he said conversationally, as if he hadn't just struck her. You moved it. You're always moving my things, reorganizing everything like you own this place. But you don't own anything here, Margaret. Everything in this apartment belongs to me, including you. I woke up gasping, my own hand pressed to my lip where I could still feel the phantom pain of David's strike. My studio apartment was dark and quiet, the familiar sounds of late-night Portland traffic filtering through the thin walls. But the taste of blood was still in my mouth, and my heart was pounding as if I had been the one cowering in fear. I stumbled to the bathroom and turned on the light, expecting to see my own familiar face in the mirror. Instead, for just a split second, I saw Margaret's terrified features staring back at me before my reflection returned to normal. The ring on my finger felt warm, almost hot, and when I tried to remove it, it wouldn't budge. It wasn't stuck. It simply refused to slide off, as if it had somehow fused with my skin. The second vision came 2 nights later. This time, I was prepared for the disorientation of being in someone else's body, but I wasn't prepared for the escalation of violence I was about to witness. Margaret was in the same Pearl District apartment, but now there were obvious signs of abuse that I had missed in the first vision. A lampshade was askew, obviously hastily straightened. There was a small hole in the drywall near the kitchen, about fist-sized. Margaret moved carefully through the space, her posture unconsciously protective. One arm held slightly across her ribs as if they were tender. She was packing. Quietly, methodically. She was putting clothes into a small suitcase, choosing items that wouldn't be immediately missed. I could feel her desperation, her careful planning, the way she had been thinking through every detail of her escape for weeks. She had $1,500 in cash hidden inside a hollowed-out book, money she had been saving from her grocery budget, $20 or $30 at a time. She had researched women's shelters in other states, memorized phone numbers, planned a route to the Greyhound station that wouldn't take her past David's office. "This is it," she whispered to herself, and I felt her mixture of terror and hope. After tonight, I'll be free. But as she zipped up the suitcase, I heard those familiar heavy footsteps in the hallway outside the apartment. David was coming home early. Margaret's carefully laid plans crumbled in an instant as panic took over. She shoved the suitcase under the bed and tried to smooth her hair, to look casual and unsuspecting, but there wasn't enough time. The door opened, and David stepped inside with the predatory awareness of someone who senses that their territory has been disturbed. His eyes swept the apartment, taking in details that most people would miss. The slight disarray of the closet, the way Margaret was standing too stiffly near the bedroom door, the faint smell of fear that seemed to permeate the air. "Going somewhere?" he asked quietly. "No, I was just cleaning," Margaret said, but her voice betrayed her. The lie was transparent, desperate. David walked slowly to the bedroom, and I felt Margaret's heart hammering against her ribs as he bent down and pulled the suitcase from under the bed. When he stood up, his face had gone completely blank, which was somehow more terrifying than his usual controlled anger. "Were you going to leave me a note?" he asked conversationally. "Or were you just going to disappear like a coward?" "David, please, let me explain." "Explain what? How you were going to steal from me? How you were going to embarrass me by running away like some pathetic victim?" He opened the suitcase and began methodically removing items, examining each piece of clothing as if it were evidence in a trial. "How long have you been planning this, Margaret? Weeks? Months?" Margaret didn't answer, and her silence seemed to enrage him more than any words could have. He grabbed her by the hair and dragged her to the living room, throwing her down onto the expensive leather couch with enough force to knock the wind out of her lungs. I felt every impact, every moment of pain and humiliation, as if it were happening to my own body. "You belong to me," David said, kneeling beside the couch and gripping her face in it. "I own you. I bought this apartment for you. I buy your clothes. I pay for your food. Everything you are exists because I allow it. And you thought you could just leave?" Through Margaret's eyes, I saw something shift in David's expression, a coldness that went beyond anger into something much more dangerous. This wasn't just about control anymore. This was about punishment, about making sure she never tried to leave again. "You want to know what happens to ungrateful women who try to run away from me?" he whispered. "I'm going to show you." I woke up screaming. The phantom pain of David's grip was still burning on my cheeks, and I could taste the metallic fear that had flooded Margaret's mouth. My hands were shaking as I stumbled to the kitchen and turned on every light in my studio apartment. The ring felt like it was burning my finger, but when I looked down at it, there were no visible signs of heat or damage. I spent the rest of the night researching psychometry, the supposed ability of objects to retain emotional imprints from their previous owners. The internet was full of accounts from people who claimed to have experienced similar phenomena: vintage clothing that carried the memories of their original owners, antique furniture that replayed traumatic scenes, jewelry that bound the wearer to the experiences of the dead. Most of it sounded like elaborate fiction, but after what I had experienced, I was willing to consider possibilities that I would have dismissed as nonsense just days before. The third vision was the worst. This time, Margaret was trapped in what I recognized as the same Pearl District apartment, but it had been transformed into a prison. The windows were covered with security bars that had been installed on the inside, keeping people in rather than keeping intruders out. The front door had multiple locks, all keyed from the outside. Margaret was wearing the same clothes she had been wearing when David caught her trying to leave, and I realized with horror that days or even weeks had passed since her failed escape attempt. She was thinner now, moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned that any wrong step could result in violence. There were fresh bruises on her arms, and what looked like finger-shaped marks around her throat. The apartment felt like a tomb, silent except for Margaret's careful breathing and the occasional sound of traffic from the street far below. Margaret was writing in a journal, her handwriting shaky but determined. Through her eyes, I could read the words she was putting down on paper. If something happens to me, David Chen killed me. He has been holding me prisoner in his apartment at 1247 Northwest Hoyt Street, apartment 15B, for 3 weeks. I tried to leave him and he said he would never let me go. He said if he can't have me, no one can. My name is Margaret Chen, and I am 28 years old. Please tell my sister Linda that I love her, and I'm sorry I couldn't call. The sound of keys in the front door made Margaret quickly hide the journal under the couch cushions. I felt her heart rate spike as the multiple locks were turned, each one clicking with the finality of a coffin lid closing. David entered the apartment carrying groceries. Just enough food for one person, I noticed. He had stopped pretending that Margaret was anything other than a prisoner. "Did you miss me?" he asked with false cheerfulness, setting the bags on the kitchen counter. "I brought your favorite soup, Campbell's chicken noodle. You remember chicken noodle soup, don't you, Margaret? From when you were a little girl and your mother would take care of you when you were sick?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. I could feel her thoughts racing, trying to find safe responses that wouldn't trigger his anger. She had learned the hard way that any sign of defiance or depression would result in punishment. "I've been thinking," David continued, unpacking the groceries with mechanical precision, "about our future together, about how we can make this work long-term. And I've realized that the problem isn't with us, it's with other people. With the outside world trying to interfere in our relationship." He turned to look at her, and I saw an expression in his eyes that made Margaret's blood turn to ice. It was the look of someone who had made a terrible decision and found peace in it. "So I've decided that we don't need the outside world anymore," David said calmly. "We have everything we need right here. You, me, this beautiful apartment. We can be happy together, Margaret. Forever." The way he said forever made it clear that he wasn't talking about a long and happy marriage. He was talking about making sure that Margaret would never leave him, never betray him, never embarrass him again. And there was only one way to guarantee that level of control. Margaret must have understood too, because I felt her terror spike to levels that made my own vision blur. She was going to die in this apartment, soon, and David was going to make sure it looked like suicide, or an accident, or maybe he would just make her disappear entirely. "David," she whispered, "please, I love you. I won't try to leave again, I promise. We can be happy together. We can—" "Shh," he said, crossing the room with that same predatory grace I had seen before. "Don't ruin this moment with lies. We both know you don't love me, but that's okay, Margaret. Love isn't necessary for what comes next." I woke up with tears streaming down my face, Margaret's terror still coursing through my veins like poison. But this time, I didn't wake up in my own apartment. I woke up in the Pearl District apartment, standing in the same living room where I had watched David plan Margaret's murder. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, which no longer had security bars. The expensive furniture was gone, replaced with moving boxes and the detritus of someone else's life. I was still myself. When I looked down, I saw my own hands, my own clothes. But I was standing in Margaret's apartment, somehow transported across Portland while I slept. The ring on my finger was no longer warm. It was ice cold, and it had begun to emit a faint humming sound, like an electrical wire under high tension. A woman's voice behind me said, "You can see it now, can't you? What he did to me." I turned around slowly, knowing what I would find but hoping desperately that I was wrong. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway, exactly as she had appeared in my visions but translucent, like a photograph printed on glass. She was wearing the same clothes from that final night, and her throat bore the unmistakable marks of strangulation. "He killed you," I said, and my voice sounded strange in the empty apartment. 3 days after that last vision, Margaret confirmed. "He made it look like suicide. Typed a note on my laptop saying I was depressed, that I couldn't handle our relationship problems. The police barely investigated. David played the grieving boyfriend perfectly." "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "Because he's going to do it again," Margaret said, and her transparent form began to flicker like a candle in the wind. "He's already found someone new, a girl named Jessica who works at the coffee shop on Northwest 23rd. She thinks he's charming, romantic. She has no idea what he's capable of." I felt the blood drain from my face. David was still out there, still hunting, still finding new victims to control and eventually destroy. Margaret's death had been just one in what would become a series if no one stopped him. "The ring won't come off until you help her," Margaret continued. "Until you find a way to warn Jessica, to save her from what I went through. But be careful. David is very smart, and he's very good at making people disappear when they threaten his plans. Why don't you warn her yourself?" I asked. "You're already dead. What can he do to you?" Margaret's expression grew sad, and she began to fade even more. "The dead can only reach the living through objects that hold our pain. The ring is the only connection I have to your world. Without someone wearing it, someone experiencing my memories, I have no voice at all." The apartment began to blur around the edges, and I felt myself being pulled back to my own studio above the coffee shop. The last thing I heard was Margaret's voice, growing fainter with each word. "Save her, please. Don't let him do to Jessica what he did to me." I found myself back in my own bed, fully clothed and covered in sweat. But the memory of standing in Margaret's apartment was as vivid as any waking experience. I knew with absolute certainty that it had been real, that Margaret's ghost was somehow using the ring to reach across the boundary between life and death. I spent the next day researching David Chen, and what I found made my blood run cold. He was a successful investment banker with an office in downtown Portland, exactly the kind of man who could afford a luxury apartment in the Pearl District. His social media profiles showed him at charity events and business dinners, always impeccably dressed and charming. There were photos of him with several different women over the past few years, but none of the relationships seemed to last very long. I found Margaret's obituary in the Oregonian archives. She had been 28 years old, a freelance graphic designer who had moved to Portland from San Francisco. The obituary mentioned that she died by suicide, survived by her sister Linda and her parents. There was no mention of David, which struck me as odd for someone who was supposedly her boyfriend. More disturbing was what I found when I searched for other women who had died by suicide in Portland over the past 3 years. There were 5 cases that shared troubling similarities. Young women, all in their 20s, all found dead in their apartments with typed suicide notes. All of them had been dating successful, charming men who disappeared from their social media accounts shortly after their deaths. David Chen wasn't just a killer. He was a serial killer who had perfected his method over years of practice. He found vulnerable women, isolated them from their support systems, and when they tried to leave, he murdered them and made it look like suicide. The police weren't connecting the dots because the deaths occurred in different precincts, and domestic violence cases that ended in suicide rarely received intensive investigation. Jessica was in immediate danger, and I was the only person who knew it. I found Jessica working at Stumptown Coffee on Northwest 23rd Avenue, exactly where Margaret had said she would be. She was probably 25, with auburn hair and the kind of natural beauty that came from not trying too hard. She moved through her shift with efficient grace, chatting easily with regular customers and newcomers alike. When the afternoon rush died down, I approached the counter. "Hi," I said, trying to sound casual despite the urgency churning in my stomach. "I'm wondering if you know someone named David Chen. Tall guy, blonde hair, works in finance." Jessica's face lit up with the unmistakable glow of someone in the early stages of falling in love. "Oh, David, yes, he's amazing. We've been dating for about 2 weeks now. He's so sweet and thoughtful. He brings me flowers, takes me to these incredible restaurants. I think he might be the one, you know? Why do you ask? Do you know him?" My heart sank. 2 weeks was exactly the timeline Margaret had described, the honeymoon period when David was charming and attentive before he started showing his true nature. Jessica was already falling into his carefully laid trap. "I need to tell you something about David," I said carefully. "Something important. Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" Jessica's expression shifted from curious to wary. "Who are you? Are you his ex-girlfriend or something? Because David told me his ex was kind of unstable, that she might try to cause problems for us." The manipulation had already begun. David was preemptively discrediting anyone who might try to warn Jessica about him, painting them as jealous or mentally ill. It was a brilliant strategy that would make Jessica dismiss any warnings as the desperate lies of a scorned woman. "I'm not his ex," I said. "My name is Mike, and I live in Southeast Portland. I found something that belonged to his last girlfriend, Margaret Chen, and when I tried to return it, I learned some things about David that you need to know." "Margaret?" Jessica's expression grew confused. David never mentioned anyone named Margaret. He said his last relationship ended over a year ago. "Margaret died 3 months ago," I said quietly. "David was with her when she died. He told the police it was suicide, but I have reason to believe he killed her." Jessica took a step back from the counter, her face flushing with anger. "That's a horrible thing to say about someone. David would never hurt anyone. He's gentle and kind, and he hits women," I interrupted. "He isolates them from their friends and family. He controls every aspect of their lives until they try to leave, and then he kills them and makes it look like suicide. Margaret was the 5th woman he's done this to." "You're crazy," Jessica said, but I could see uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "David isn't like that. You don't even know him." I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos I had taken of Margaret's obituary and the other suspicious suicide cases. "Look at the dates," I said. "Look at the similarities. All young women, all found dead in their apartments, all supposedly by suicide. And if you search social media, you'll find photos of David with most of them before they died." Jessica stared at the phone screen, her face growing pale. I could see her mentally reviewing her interactions with David, looking for warning signs she might have missed. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was compelling enough to plant seeds of doubt. "Even if this is true," she said finally, "why should I trust you? I don't know you. You could be making all of this up." Before I could answer, I felt the familiar tingling sensation in the ring. Margaret was trying to communicate, to provide proof that would convince Jessica to save herself. The temperature in the coffee shop dropped noticeably, and several customers looked around with confusion as their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. Jessica gasped as Margaret's translucent form materialized behind the espresso machine, visible only to us. Margaret looked exactly as she had in my visions, beautiful but haunted, with the unmistakable marks of strangulation around her throat. "He's going to kill you," Margaret said, her voice carrying the hollow echo of the dead. "Just like he killed me. Just like he killed Sarah and Amanda and Rachel and Lisa. We tried to leave him, and he made sure we could never leave anyone ever again." Jessica's face went white as paper, and she gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling. Other customers in the coffee shop were beginning to notice the temperature drop and the strange atmosphere, but none of them could see Margaret's ghost. "This isn't real," Jessica whispered. "This can't be real. He's going to take you to his apartment next week," Margaret continued, her form flickering like a dying light bulb. "He'll say he wants to cook dinner for you, wants to show you how much he cares, but once you're there, he'll start showing his true nature. He'll get angry about small things. He'll accuse you of flirting with other men. He'll make you feel like everything is your fault." "Stop," Jessica said, but her voice carried no conviction. "Then he'll isolate you. He'll say your friends are jealous of your relationship, that your family doesn't understand what you have together. He'll convince you to move in with him, and once you do, the doors will have locks that only open from the outside. The windows will have bars. And when you finally realize what he is and try to leave," Margaret's form began to fade, but her final words echoed through the coffee shop like a death sentence. "He'll make sure you never leave at all." The temperature returned to normal, and the other customers went back to their conversations, apparently unaware that they had just witnessed a communication from the dead. Jessica stood frozen behind the counter, tears streaming down her face as the full horror of her situation became clear. "What do I do?" she whispered. "If all of this is true, if David really is, how do I get away from him?" "You disappear," I said. "Tonight. Don't go home, don't pack, don't call anyone. Just leave Portland and don't come back. Change your name if you have to. Move somewhere he'll never think to look for you. But my job, my apartment, my life, Your life won't matter if you're dead, I said bluntly. Margaret tried to plan her escape carefully, and it got her killed. David is too smart, too controlling. The only way to survive him is to vanish completely. Jessica nodded slowly, understanding the terrible mathematics of her situation. She could start over somewhere else, or she could stay and become David's next victim. There was no middle ground, no compromise that would keep her safe. Will you help me? She asked. I don't have much money and I don't know where to go. I'll do whatever I can, I promised, and I meant it. Margaret's ghost had chosen me to be Jessica's protector, and I wouldn't let her down. We spent the next hour planning Jessica's escape. She would finish her shift normally, then meet me at Union Station. I would buy her a bus ticket to Seattle, give her what cash I could spare, and help her disappear into the network of women's shelters and support services that existed for domestic violence survivors. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was her only chance. As I left the coffee shop, the ring on my finger felt different, lighter somehow, as if some of the trapped energy was beginning to dissipate. Margaret's ghost appeared one more time as I walked down Northwest 23rd Avenue, her form more solid and peaceful than before. Thank you, she said simply. You've given Jessica the chance I never had. What happens now? I asked. Does this end here? Margaret's expression grew sad. David will find other women. He'll keep killing until someone stops him permanently. But Jessica will live, and that's something. That's hope. The ring. We'll stay with you until David is dead, Margaret finished. Every woman he kills will add their voice to mine. Eventually, there will be too many of us to ignore. Eventually, someone will listen. She began to fade, but her final words carried the weight of prophecy. Be careful, Mike. David doesn't know about you yet, but he will. And when he realizes what you've done, he'll come for you too. Jessica made it out of Portland that night. I put her on the 11:47 p.m. bus to Seattle, gave her $300 cash, and watched her disappear into a new life. She sent me a single text message from a new phone number 3 days later. Safe, thank you. David Chen reported Jessica as a missing person 2 days after she vanished. He played the role of the concerned boyfriend perfectly, giving interviews to local news stations about his worry for Jessica's safety. He posted missing person flyers around Northwest Portland, organized search parties, and even offered a reward for information about her whereabouts. But I could see through his performance. In the news interviews, his eyes were cold and calculating, already planning his next move. He wasn't worried about Jessica. He was angry that his prey had escaped. And Margaret was right. It was only a matter of time before he figured out that I was the one who had helped her. The ring remained on my finger, as immovable as ever. Sometimes at night, I could hear whispers from the other women David had killed. Sarah, Amanda, Rachel, Lisa. Their voices joining Margaret's in a chorus of the damned. They told me their stories, showed me their final moments, and made me understand the true scope of David Chen's evil. He had been killing for almost 5 years, refining his technique with each murder. He chose women who were isolated, who had moved to Portland from other cities and hadn't yet built strong support networks. He studied them carefully, learning their vulnerabilities and insecurities, then used that knowledge to control them completely. By the time they realized what he was, it was too late to escape. The police had never connected the deaths because David was careful to space them out, to vary his methods slightly, to make each one look like an individual tragedy rather than part of a pattern. He was protected by his wealth, his social status, and the systematic dismissal of domestic violence cases that ended in suicide. But now he had made a mistake. Jessica's escape had broken his pattern, created a loose thread that could unravel his entire operation. He would be more careful now, more paranoid, but also more desperate. And desperate serial killers make mistakes. I started documenting everything. I wrote down every vision the ring showed me, recorded every whispered confession from David's victims, compiled evidence that might eventually convince the police to investigate. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. David was too smart, too well connected, too careful about covering his tracks. The dead women knew it too. Their voices grew stronger each night, more insistent, more demanding. They didn't want justice. They wanted revenge. They wanted David to experience the terror and helplessness that he had inflicted on them, and they wanted me to be the instrument of that revenge. He'll find another woman soon, Margaret whispered to me one night as I sat in my studio apartment, surrounded by newspaper clippings and police reports. Someone young and vulnerable and trusting, someone who will believe his lies about love and devotion. Then we'll warn her too, I said. We'll save as many as we can. No, Margaret said. and her voice carried a finality that made my blood run cold. "He's learned from Jessica's escape. He'll be more careful now, more controlling. The next woman won't have a chance to run." She was right, and I knew it. David would adapt his methods, close the loopholes that had allowed Jessica to escape. He would isolate his next victim more completely, watch her more carefully, ensure that no helpful strangers could interfere with his plans. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. "What the police won't do," Margaret said. "What the justice system can't do. What needs to be done to protect all the women who will come after." The implication was clear. Margaret and the other dead women wanted me to kill David Chen. They wanted me to become a murderer in order to stop a serial killer. The ring on my finger grew warm as their voices rose in agreement, a chorus of the dead demanding blood for blood. I spent weeks wrestling with the moral implications of what they were asking. Could I really take another person's life, even to save innocent women from torture and death? Was murder ever justified, even when committed to prevent greater murders? Would killing David make me a hero, or just another killer? The answer came when David found his next victim. Her name was Amy Thornton, and she was 24 years old, fresh out of college and new to Portland. She worked at a bookstore in the Alberta Arts District and lived alone in a small apartment above a yoga studio. She was perfect for David's purposes: young, isolated, trusting, and far from any family support system. I watched him pursue her with the same methodical patience he had shown with his previous victims. He became a regular at the bookstore, chatting with Amy about literature and philosophy, gradually building a connection based on shared interests and intellectual compatibility. He was charming and attentive, bringing her coffee and flowers, taking her to art galleries and independent films. Amy fell for him completely. Through Margaret's ring, I could see the progression of their relationship, could watch David slowly tightening the web around another innocent victim. He isolated her from her co-workers by suggesting they were jealous of her success. He convinced her that her family back in Ohio didn't understand her artistic aspirations. He gradually took control of her social calendar, her finances, her entire life. The worst part was watching Amy rationalize his controlling behavior as love and devotion. When David criticized her choice of friends, she saw it as protective concern. When he monitored her text messages and social media accounts, she interpreted it as romantic interest in her life. When he suggested she move in with him after only 6 weeks of dating, she saw it as a sign of his commitment to their future together. I tried to warn her, but David had learned from Jessica's escape. He had already poisoned Amy against outside interference, telling her that his unstable ex-girlfriend might try to cause problems for them. When I approached Amy at the bookstore, she immediately became defensive and suspicious. "David warned me about you," she said coldly. "He said his ex might try to break us up with lies and manipulation. I'm not interested in whatever jealous fantasy you're trying to sell." I showed her the same evidence I had shown Jessica: the obituaries, the pattern of suspicious deaths, the photos of David with his previous victims. But Amy dismissed it all as elaborate fabrications created by a scorned woman. David's psychological conditioning had been too thorough, too skillfully applied. "David loves me," Amy said firmly. "He would never hurt me or anyone else. You need professional help, and you need to stay away from us." 2 weeks later, Amy moved into David's Pearl District apartment, the same apartment where Margaret had been held prisoner and murdered. I watched through the ring's visions as David gradually revealed his true nature, as Amy's new home became her prison, as her dreams of love and partnership transformed into a nightmare of control and violence. But this time, David was even more careful. The apartment now had soundproofing installed between the walls. The windows were equipped with security glass that couldn't be broken from the inside. There were cameras in every room, monitoring Amy's every movement even when David wasn't home. He had created the perfect killing chamber, a place where his victims could scream and fight and plead without any hope of being heard or rescued. Amy lasted 3 months before she tried to escape. She had been planning carefully, saving money, researching women's shelters, preparing for the day when she could slip away from David's control. But he had been monitoring her internet usage, tracking her movements, reading her private thoughts through hidden cameras and recording devices. When Amy made her move, David was ready for her. The final vision was the worst thing I had ever experienced. Through Margaret's ring, I felt every moment of Amy's terror as David revealed the true extent of his preparations. The apartment that had been her home became her tomb, and David became the monster she had never imagined he could be. "Did you really think you could outsmart me?" David asked conversationally as he zip-tied Amy's hands behind her back. "Did you think I hadn't learned from Margaret's little rebellion? I've had months to prepare for this moment, Amy. Months to plan exactly how this will end. Amy tried to scream, but the soundproofing absorbed her voice completely. She tried to fight, but David was stronger and had the advantage of preparation. She tried to reason with him, to appeal to whatever humanity might still exist beneath his cold exterior, but his eyes held no mercy, no recognition of her as a fellow human being. "I want you to understand something," David said as he prepared the rope that would end Amy's life. "This isn't personal. This isn't about love or hate or passion. This is simply about control. You tried to leave me, and that cannot be allowed. Other women need to understand that leaving me is not an option." Through Amy's eyes, I saw David's face in those final moments. Calm, calculating, completely without remorse. He wasn't acting in a moment of passion or rage. This was premeditated murder, carried out with the cold efficiency of someone who had done it many times before. Amy's death was slow and terrible. David made sure she experienced every moment of her ending, made sure she understood that her suffering was the price of defying him. When it was over, he carefully staged the scene to look like suicide, typed a note on Amy's laptop explaining her depression and inability to cope with their relationship problems. The police investigation lasted less than a week. David played the grieving boyfriend perfectly, and Amy's death was officially ruled a suicide. Another young woman had been erased from the world, and her killer was already planning his next victim. That night, Amy's ghost joined the chorus of voices that whispered through Margaret's ring. She told me her story, showed me her final moments, and added her voice to the demand for justice that would never come through legal channels. "He's getting bolder," Amy said, her translucent form flickering with rage and pain. "More confident. He's planning to kill again soon, and he's not going to wait as long between victims. You have to stop him." "How?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The same way he stops us," Amy replied. "Permanently." The dead women were right. David Chen was a serial killer who would never be caught by conventional law enforcement. He was too smart, too careful, too well protected by his wealth and social status. The only way to stop him was to kill him, to become a murderer in order to prevent more murders. I spent 2 weeks planning David's death. I studied his routines, learned his schedule, identified opportunities when he would be vulnerable. He worked late at his downtown office most weeknights, often staying until 9 or 10 o'clock. The building's parking garage was poorly lit and minimally secured, the perfect place for an ambush. On a rainy Thursday evening in November, I waited in the shadows of the parking garage, a hunting knife hidden in my jacket pocket. Margaret's ring was burning hot against my finger, and the voices of David's victims whispered encouragement in my ears. This was justice, they told me. This was necessary. This was the only way to protect future victims from David's evil. David emerged from the elevator precisely at 9:47 p.m., just as he had every Thursday for the past month. He walked toward his BMW with the confident stride of someone who had never had to fear for his safety, someone who existed at the top of the predator chain. He had no idea that tonight he would become prey. I stepped out of the shadows when he was unlocking his car, the knife ready in my hand. David turned at the sound of my footsteps, and for the first time since I had been watching him, I saw genuine surprise cross his features. "You," he said, recognition dawning in his cold blue eyes. "You're the one who made Jessica disappear." "Among other things," I replied, raising the knife. David's expression shifted from surprise to calculating assessment. He was evaluating me as a threat, measuring my capabilities against his own, looking for weaknesses he could exploit. Even facing his own death, he remained the predator, looking for angles and advantages. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he asked, slowly reaching into his jacket pocket. "You think killing me will bring back Margaret and Amy and the others?" "No," I said honestly, "but it will save the women you haven't killed yet." David smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than any rage or fear would have been. "There will always be women like them," he said, "weak, trusting, desperate for love. And there will always be men like me to take advantage of them. Killing me won't change that." He was probably right, but it didn't matter. I couldn't save every woman from every predator, but I could save future victims from this particular monster. Sometimes that was enough. David drew a pistol from his jacket pocket with practiced smoothness, but I was already moving. The knife caught him in the throat before he could raise the gun, and his blood sprayed across the concrete floor of the parking garage. He dropped to his knees, his hands pressed uselessly against the wound, his eyes wide with shock and indignation. "This isn't how it was supposed to end," he gurgled, blood frothing from his mouth. "It never is." I said, and drove the knife home again. David Chen died on the floor of a parking garage, surrounded by the expensive cars of other successful people who would never know how close they had come to having a serial killer as a neighbor. His death would be investigated as a robbery gone wrong, another random act of urban violence. The police would never connect it to his victims, would never realize that justice had finally been served. As David's life ebbed away, Margaret's ring grew cold on my finger. The whispers of the dead women faded to silence, and for the first time in months, I felt truly alone with my thoughts. The ring slipped off my finger easily, falling to the concrete floor beside David's body like a piece of discarded jewelry. But the voices didn't stay silent for long. As I walked away from David's corpse, I began to hear new whispers, darker and more insistent than before. The ring had found a new purpose, a new mission. There were other predators in Portland, other men who hurt women with impunity. The dead demanded justice, and they had chosen me as their instrument. I picked up the ring and slipped it back onto my finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for me, as if I had been made for it. The whispers grew stronger, showing me visions of other women in danger, other men who needed to be stopped, a college professor who drugged his students, a landlord who demanded sexual favors in exchange for rent, a police officer who used his badge to intimidate vulnerable women into compliance. So many predators, so many victims, so much work to be done. I walked out of the parking garage and into the rainy Portland night, Margaret's ring burning cold on my finger, and the voices of the dead guiding my steps toward the next monster who needed killing. David Chen was dead, but his death had only been the beginning. The ring had chosen me to be justice for the voiceless, vengeance for the forgotten, protection for the vulnerable. It was a burden I would carry for the rest of my life, moving through the shadows of the city like an angel of death, eliminating threats that the legal system couldn't or wouldn't address. And somewhere in the darkness, new ghosts whispered their stories of abuse and murder, adding their voices to the growing chorus that demanded blood for blood, death for death, justice by any means necessary. The wedding ring I found at a pawn shop had made me relive someone else's tragic marriage. But more than that, it had made me into something new, something necessary in a world where monsters wore human faces and evil hid behind charm and respectability. I was no longer just Mike, the guy who bought a cursed ring at a pawn shop. I was something darker, something more dangerous. I was the hand of the dead, reaching across the veil to balance the scales of justice in ways that the living never could. And in Portland's dark corners, where predators hunted and victims suffered in silence, that was exactly what the city needed. If this story of supernatural justice and cursed objects kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button to let me know you want more paranormal horror content. The ring Margaret used to communicate from beyond the grave represents just one example of how objects can hold on to the trauma and emotions of their previous owners. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest supernatural horror stories, paranormal investigations, and true accounts of cursed objects that refuse to let the dead rest in peace. Your subscription helps us continue bringing you the most terrifying and authentic supernatural content on YouTube. Drop a comment below sharing your own experiences with objects that seem to carry dark histories, vintage jewelry, antique furniture, estate sale finds that brought more than you bargained for into your home. Have you ever felt like an object was trying to communicate with you, or experienced visions and dreams that weren't your own? Your stories help build our community of people who understand that some things exist beyond the boundaries of normal reality. Share this video with friends who appreciate supernatural horror that goes beyond cheap jump scares into genuinely unsettling territory. The story of Margaret's ring and her quest for justice from beyond the grave deserves to be heard by others who understand that sometimes the dead don't rest peacefully, especially when their killers walk free among the living. Remember to check out our playlist of cursed object stories, paranormal investigations, and supernatural horror narrations. Each video explores the dark intersection between our world and the realm of the dead, showing how trauma and evil can persist long after death claims their original victims. Until next time, be careful what you buy at pawn shops and estate sales.